Imagine sitting across from two young men, brothers, who calmly confess to murdering their own sisters. No shame, no hesitation, just the cold truth, and no one could understand why. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The Turner family lived in a quiet Midwestern neighborhood, the kind of town where people still left their doors unlocked at night, and children played freely in the cul-de-sac. Robert, the father, spent his days working long hours at a local manufacturing plant. His hands were rough, his back tired, but he wore his labor like a badge of honor. Denise, the mother, worked part-time at the library, balancing books and bills while keeping the household in order. They weren't wealthy, but their home carried warmth. The laughter at the dinner table, the smell of fresh cornbread, and the echoes of siblings fighting over the TV remote painted a picture of a typical American family. Neighbors saw smiles, kindness, and discipline, but never conflict deep enough to raise suspicion. To the outside world, they were ordinary, and yet hidden within that normalcy, small cracks had already begun to form. Daniel, at 22, was the eldest. He bore the weight of responsibility naturally, often stepping into the role of a second father when Robert was away. Marcus, 19, was more restless, bright but volatile, sometimes caught between boyhood immaturity and a man's pride. Emily, 17, carried the promise of the future. Teachers praised her intelligence, her dedication, her leadership qualities. Sarah, just 15, was the spark of the household. She had a wit that disarmed people, a way of making others laugh even when they didn't feel like it. To Robert and Denise, their children represented hope, proof that their sacrifices were worth it. At church and in the community, people would remark on how close-knit the family seemed. They weren't perfect, but their bond appeared unshakable. The home echoed with inside jokes, teasing, and memories being created one small moment at a time. But in private, those bonds sometimes strained. Daniel's authority as the eldest clashed with Marcus's hunger to be seen as his own man. Arguments simmered beneath the surface, heated exchanges about responsibility, respect, and the future. Emily and Sarah, though close, sometimes felt overshadowed by their brother's louder presence. Denise tried to smooth things over, reminding everyone that family came first. Robert, exhausted from work, often grew quiet, leaving discipline to his wife. Still, nothing seemed unusual enough to cause alarm. After all, what family doesn't argue? What siblings don't test each other's limits? To the Turners, these were just the growing things of life. To outsiders, nothing looked amiss. Yet the cracks widened. Daniel grew jealous of Marcus's control. He felt overlooked, diminished, like his opinions were dismissed before they could even be heard. Emily noticed it, confiding to a friend once that Marcus seemed different lately, more irritable, less patient. Sarah, ever the peacemaker, would tease Marcus to lighten the mood, but even she sensed something had shifted. In the quiet moments after arguments when apologies should have come, there was instead silence. And silence, left long enough, begins to rot. They looked like any other family, the narrator reminds us, but no one could predict what was about to unfold.
The siblings shared the same roof, the same kitchen table, and the same small-town life. But like many families, their relationships carried an undercurrent of tension. Daniel, the oldest, had always felt overlooked, overshadowed by his younger brother's confidence and his sister's easy laughter. Marcus, at 19, was quick-witted but reckless, often clashing with his father over responsibilities. Emily, at 17, was blossoming into her independence, talking about college applications and friendships beyond their small town. Sarah, the youngest, at 15, was full of teenage energy, sometimes playful, sometimes moody, but still the light of the household. These contrasts, although normal to an outsider, became sharper in private moments. Resentments grew in silences, in rolled eyes across the dinner table, in arguments that seemed trivial but left invisible scars. Families often fracture not in one explosive moment, but through a slow accumulation of unspoken bitterness. Arguments in the house became louder, more frequent. Emily challenged her brothers when they mocked her plans, reminding them that she wanted more for her life. Marcus sneered that she thought she was better than them. Daniel would retreat in silence, but his silence held its own kind of weight. Their parents noticed the changes, slamming doors, skipped family dinners, half-hearted apologies. But they brushed it aside as typical sibling rivalry. What they could not see was how deeply these rivalries cut, especially when Daniel and Marcus began turning their frustrations inward and feeding them off each other. Resentment became a bond. They spent hours together outside, pacing the backyard, muttering about how no one in the house respected them, about how their sisters always seemed to get away with everything. It was in these private exchanges that an unhealthy sense of alliance began to form, solidifying into something far more dangerous. The brothers' frustrations didn't arise in a vacuum. Daniel had recently dropped out of community college after struggling with grades, something he never confessed to his parents. Marcus worked odd jobs but quit as often as he was hired. Both felt trapped, left behind by a world that didn't reward them, while their sisters seemed full of possibility. Emily with her books and ambitions, Sarah with her charm and youthful energy. It made Daniel and Marcus feel small, as though the future was slipping from their grasp. Instead of channeling their frustration into effort, they sought someone to blame. And in the walls of their home, their sisters became the focus of their bitterness. Jealousy doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it settles in like dust, quiet but suffocating. And in that house, jealousy became fuel, slowly, steadily, feeding a fire that will one day rage uncontrollably. The parents, wearied from their own struggles, missed the deeper warning signs. To them, their children's arguments seemed like the usual noise of adolescence. They reminded the brothers to be kind, scolded them for being harsh, and urged Emily and Sarah to avoid provoking their older siblings. But warnings only sharpened the brothers' resentment. "Why is it always us getting blamed?" Marcus once muttered, his voice low enough to avoid punishment, but loud enough for Daniel to nod in agreement. Emily tried to keep the peace, occasionally softening the edges with humor, but her determination to pursue her dreams only highlighted the brothers' lack of direction. Sarah, young and outspoken, teased them relentlessly, not realizing that her playful jabs struck at fragile egos. What could have been forgotten arguments among siblings instead took root in Daniel and Marcus's minds, turning normal teenage squabbles into seeds of hostility. Family friends noticed changes too. The once warm and lively household grew quieter in public. Daniel appeared withdrawn to church, his once eager smile replaced with a blank stare. Marcus hung around the back, restless, avoiding eye contact. Emily and Sarah, however, still carried the brightness of youth, laughing with friends and confiding in one another. This contrast only deepened the brothers' sense of alienation. Inside their home, the tension was palpable. Small details painted the picture. The way Daniel's jaw clenched when Emily mentioned her college essays, the way Marcus slammed his fist on the table when Sarah borrowed his headphones without asking. What once seemed like harmless sibling drama was becoming something darker. Families often believe love will outweigh rivalry, that blood will mend what's broken.
But sometimes the opposite unfolds. Resentment digs in deeper, and love isn't enough to pull it out.
Arguments that had once been brief, forgettable squabbles began to linger. Every fight felt heavier than the last. Daniel's silence grew longer, Marcus's words sharper. Emily, though strong-willed, started avoiding conversations with them altogether, choosing instead to retreat to her room with her notebooks. Sarah, still young, didn't understand the depth of her brother's resentment. Her laughter still echoed through the house, but it was no longer received with affection. Instead, Daniel and Marcus exchanged glances, their frustrations silently validated in each other. Their bond became exclusive, almost secretive, as if the rest of the family no longer belonged to them. It was this shared bitterness, whispered in hushed tones when the house was quiet, that built the foundation of a dangerous idea. No one outside those conversations would have believed how far it could go, because no one expected two brothers to let their anger cross that line. The first real sign of danger came during a family dinner. Their father asked Emily about her future plans, and she spoke excitedly about scholarships and moving away for school. The mother smiled with pride, while Sarah clapped her hands, teasing Emily about forgetting the rest of us. What should have been a light-hearted moment turned sour. Daniel's fork clattered against his plate, and Marcus muttered something under his breath that made Emily pause. She looked up, meeting his glare. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. Marcus smirked and shook his head. Their parents dismissed it as nothing, telling Emily to ignore him. But the look between the brothers was unmistakable. It was the kind of look that spoke without words, anger simmering beneath the surface. That night, Emily wrote in her journal. Daniel and Marcus, meanwhile, whispered late into the night, their words trenched in grievance. By this time, the parents noticed their sons retreating more and more from family life. They spent long hours together outside, pacing along the porch or sitting in the car parked down the street, saying little when asked where they had been. To the parents, it looked like two young men struggling to find their way. To Emily and Sarah, it felt like something heavier. Emily confided to Sarah one night, "They're not the same anymore. I don't know what's wrong, but it scares me." Sarah brushed it off, telling Emily she was overthinking. After all, they were just brothers. Annoying, difficult, sometimes cruel, but still family. Emily tried to believe that, but she couldn't ignore the way Daniel's eyes lingered with her an intensity that felt unsettling. These moments, though subtle, marked the slow unraveling of trust within the family. Love was giving way to fear. The tension reached its peak one evening when Marcus erupted in an argument over nothing more than a misplaced phone charger. Sarah had borrowed it, unaware it was his. He shouted, his words echoing through the house, startling even his parents. When Sarah laughed nervously and told him to relax, he slammed his face against the wall, inches away from her face. Silence filled the room. Emily stood quickly, pulling Sarah behind her, while their parents scolded Marcus for his temper. Marcus stormed out, but not before muttering, "You'll regret it." For the first time, Sarah didn't see her brother as just hot-headed. She saw someone capable of truly hurting her. Later, she admitted to Emily that she couldn't get his face out of her head, the look in his eyes that seemed less like anger, more like hatred. It was a moment the family would never forget. But what frightened Emily most wasn't Marcus's temper, it was Daniel's calm. Through every explosion, every slammed door, Daniel remained eerily composed. He rarely shouted, never threw things, but his silence spoke volumes. Emily Daniel once described it as a storm you can't hear but know is coming. That composure gave Marcus a sense of validation, as though his rage was justified simply because Daniel didn't stop him. Daniel's quiet approval emboldened Marcus, pushing him further into aggression. The family tried to address it, offering counseling, urging Daniel and Marcus to find work to focus on their futures. But the brothers dismissed every effort, insisting no one understood them. They had begun to see themselves as outsiders in their own home. Convinced that Emily and Sarah received more love, more attention, more respect.
What began as teenage frustration had now twisted into something dangerous, the belief that they were victims in their own family. It was late summer, a humid night, when the air pressed heavy against the walls of the family's small Midwestern home. The parents had gone to bed early, exhausted from long shifts at work. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of a ceiling fan and the sound of Emily and Sarah's muffled laughter drifting from their shared room. Emily had been reading aloud from her journal, her words carrying both hope and frustration, while Sarah playfully interrupted with jokes. In another part of the house, Daniel and Marcus sat together in silence. They hadn't spoken much in days, but their tension was unmistakable. Marcus fiddled with his hands, clenching and unclenching his fists, while Daniel's eyes remained fixed ahead, cold and unblinking. It was as if both brothers knew something was about to happen, yet neither was willing to say it out loud. The night was about to break. Sometime after midnight, Marcus stood. His footsteps creaked against the wooden floor as he walked toward the sisters' room. Daniel followed behind, silent but steady. Sarah was the first to stir when the door opened. She squinted in the dim light, confusion spreading across her face as she saw her brothers enter. "What are you doing?" she asked softly, half asleep. Daniel didn't answer. Marcus muttered something Sarah couldn't make out, his voice thick with emotion. Emily, now fully awake, sat upright. She noticed the hardness in Daniel's stare, the restless movement of Marcus's hands. Her instinct screamed that something was wrong. "Go back to bed," she said firmly, her voice carrying more command than fear. But the brothers didn't move. Instead, Daniel stepped closer to Emily's side of the bed. Sarah clutched her blanket, suddenly uneasy. The air in the room shifted from ordinary to terrifying in an instant. The first sign of violence came, not with a scream, but with silence. Daniel reached down, gripping Emily by the wrist. She gasped, pulling back, but his strength was unrelenting. Sarah cried out, trying to shove Marcus away as he blocked her path. What followed was chaos contained within 4 small walls, a struggle filled with whispered threats, muffled cries, and the sharp thud of bodies colliding against furniture. Emily fought, her voice breaking as she pleaded, "Why are you doing this? We're your sisters." Daniel didn't answer, his face expressionless as he overpowered her. Marcus, fueled by adrenaline and anger, pinned Sarah down despite her desperate attempts to break free. Their parents slept just down the hall, unaware of the nightmare unfolding. In those moments, the bond of family, the dinners, the laughter, the shared memories, was erased, replaced by a horror that words can barely capture. When it was over, the house was unbearably quiet. The kind of quiet that comes only after something irreversible. Daniel and Marcus stood over their sisters, their breathing heavy, their hands trembling, not from regret, but from the weight of what they had done. Sarah's youthful laughter would never return. Emily's strength and determination were silenced forever. For a moment, Marcus seemed shaken, pacing back and forth, muttering incoherently. Daniel, however, remained chillingly calm, his voice steady as he said, "It's done." The brothers looked at each other, bound not just by blood, but now by the darkest of secrets. The line they had crossed could never be undone. What had started as resentment had ended in tragedy. Outside, the world continued as normal. Neighbors slept, cars passed from distant roads, but inside that home, everything had changed forever.
The following morning, the Turner household stirred like any other. The parents rose early, ready for another long day of work. But as their mother moved through the kitchen, a gnawing sense of unease began to grow. The girls hadn't come down for breakfast. At first, she brushed it aside, assuming they had overslept. But when she called out their names and received no answer, her heart began to pound. The house suddenly felt too quiet, too still. She walked toward the sisters' bedroom, knocking softly, then harder. The silence on the other side was suffocating. When the door opened, what she found shattered the illusion of normalcy forever. Her screams echoed through the house,
a sound raw enough to draw the father racing down the hall. Their world, once held together by family routines and small joys, collapsed in an instant. The parents' grief was unbearable, but equally haunting was the realization of who had done this. At first, they clung to denial, unwilling to believe their sons could be responsible for such horror. But Daniel and Marcus didn't run, didn't hide, didn't even attempt to shift blame. When confronted, they admitted the truth with startling bluntness. "It was us," Daniel said flatly, his tone void of emotion. Marcus added little, only nodding, as if confirming a fact rather than confessing to a crime. Their parents, crushed under the weight of betrayal, could barely process the words. These were the same boys they had raised, the same children they had disciplined and loved. Now those same children stood in front of them, admitting to murdering their sisters as if it were nothing more than a fact of life. The pain was indescribable, the disbelief impossible to reconcile. Law enforcement arrived within hours, their flashing lights painting the quiet neighborhood in shades of red and blue. Neighbors peered out from behind curtains, whispering in disbelief. The officers who entered the house were met with a scene that would stay with them forever. Emily and Sarah's lives had been brutally cut short, their innocence destroyed by the very people meant to protect them. When questioned, Daniel spoke clearly and without hesitation. He described what they had done with an almost mechanical tone, as though recounting a list of tasks. Marcus, on the other hand, shifted between silence and incoherent muttering, his guilt masked by confusion. Yet neither brother showed the kind of remorse the investigators expected. In fact, what unsettled everyone most was how unashamed they seemed, how casually they admitted to taking the lives of their sisters. It was a confession without sorrow. The community was stunned. How could two young men from a seemingly ordinary household commit such an atrocity? The question spread faster than answers could form. Teachers recalled Emily's ambition, Sarah's laughter. Neighbors remembered the brothers playing basketball in the driveway. Nobody saw this coming. The trial that would follow promised to be long and painful, but in that moment, the spotlight was on a single fact. Daniel and Marcus had confessed openly, without pressure, without bargaining. Their words carried a cold finality. "We did it," Daniel repeated, looking directly at the officers. It wasn't a plea for help, nor an act of defiance. It was simply a statement. That chilling calm, paired with Marcus's quiet agreement, left investigators shaken. It wasn't just the crime itself that disturbed them, but the absence of remorse in the aftermath. That void made the tragedy even harder to comprehend.
The trial began months later, but the weight of the crime still hung heavy over the town. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, some holding candles in silent vigils, others holding signs demanding justice for Emily and Sarah. Inside, the courtroom was filled with a suffocating tension. The parents sat silently on the front bench, their faces pale from sleepless nights. They had lost 2 daughters, yet, in a way, they had also lost their sons. Their grief was doubled, and every court session forced them to relive the night of the murders. When Daniel entered the courtroom, he kept his chin raised, his eyes fixed ahead. Marcus, quieter, often looked down at the table in front of him. Neither brother showed the raw emotion one might expect. Their composure unsettled everyone watching. It wasn't defiance. It was detachment, and that was harder to face than anger. The prosecution laid out the evidence methodically, building a narrative of calculated violence. They displayed photographs, read text messages, and reconstructed the brothers' movements in painstaking detail. Every revelation added a new layer of disbelief. Why? That single question was repeated by the jury, the media, and even the attorneys themselves. Why would two young men, with promising lives still ahead of them, decide to destroy their family in such a violent way? The defense tried to suggest years of mental instability, pressures that had gone unnoticed, and a lack of intervention. But for most people watching, those explanations fell short. The sheer cruelty of the act overshadowed every excuse. Emily and Sarah's faces, projected on courtroom screens, served as reminders of who had truly suffered. Their stolen futures were more powerful than any argument the defense could muster. The brothers' silence only deepened the wound. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent. Guilty. Both brothers would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. Some gasped, others wept openly. Their parents sat motionless, their tears long since dried into a hollow resignation. Justice had been served, but it did not feel like victory. No sentence could undo the loss of two innocent daughters. No punishment could erase the haunting image of their sons calmly admitting to the crime. For the community, the outcome was both closure and a wound that would never fully heal. Reporters described the case as one of the most shocking tragedies in the region's history. Neighbors continue to struggle with their own disbelief, replaying memories of the family they once thought they knew. Even years later, people would remember where they were when they first heard the news. The story left an indelible scar. In the end, this was not just a tale of violence, but of broken trust. It was a story of how love within a family can be shattered in the most unthinkable way. Daniel and Marcus became symbols of betrayal, reminders of how darkness can sometimes hide in the most ordinary places. Emily and Sarah, however, remained the true center of this tragedy. Two bright young lives remembered for their laughter, their dreams, and the futures that were taken from them. Their legacy lived on through scholarships, community memorials, and the quiet prayers of those who loved them. For viewers, it leaves an unsettling reflection. What could drive brothers to such an act? And if it happened in a home that looked so normal, could it happen anywhere? Before we close, let us know in the comments how this story makes you feel. And if you're new here, click subscribe so you never miss our upcoming stories. Thanks for watching.